The 5-year-old boy's fingers were black with frostbite, but his father Ragnar Eriksson refused to bring him inside their longhouse in 9th century Norway. Little Olaf had been standing naked in the snow for 3 hours as punishment for crying during sword practice. His lips were blue, his body shaking so violently he couldn't stand straight. But Viking law said a father who raised a weak son deserved to die in battle without honor. When Olaf finally collapsed, Ragnar dragged him to the fire not out of mercy, but because dead children couldn't become warriors. This wasn't child abuse by Viking standards. This was Tuesday. Every Viking child who survived to adulthood had endured physical trials that would send modern parents to prison for decades. These weren't random acts of cruelty. They were systematic training methods designed to forge human beings capable of surviving in a world where weakness meant death for entire family. Every aspect of childhood was designed around one simple principle. If you couldn't handle pain, cold, hunger, and fear as a child, you would die as an adult. Modern child psychologists would call these practices severe abuse. Vikings called them education. Olaf's frostbite training began when he turned 4 years old. Every Viking child, male or female, was subjected to deliberate exposure to cold, starting at age 4. Parents would strip their children naked and force them to stand outside in temperatures that regularly dropped to 20 degrees below zero. The children weren't allowed to cry, move, or ask to come inside. The first time a child begged for warmth, their exposure time doubled the next day. The cold training wasn't the worst part. Viking parents believed that children who couldn't tolerate pain would grow into adults who couldn't tolerate the agony of battle wounds. Starting at age 5, Viking children underwent daily pain tolerance tests. Parents would pinch their children's skin with iron tools heated in the fire. They would twist their children's arms behind their backs until the joints nearly dislocated. They would force their children to hold burning coals in their bare hands. Children who screamed during pain training received double punishment the following day. Viking parents kept detailed mental records of every time their child showed weakness. A child who cried 3 times in 1 week might spend the entire next week sleeping outside in the snow. Parents who went easy on their children were shunned by the community and sometimes exiled completely. Children had their fingernails pulled out with iron pliers. They had hot metal brands pressed against their arms, and they were forced to walk across beds of sharp stones until their feet bled. Parents who refused to inflict this training on their children were considered weak and unfit to live among Viking. A typical Viking child might eat only once every 3 days during winter months. Parents believed that children who grew accustomed to regular meals would be unable to survive the famines that struck Viking communities every few. Adult Vikings consumed all the meat, vegetables, and dairy products first. Children received whatever scraps remained, which often meant nothing more than bone marrow and rotten fish. If a child complained about hunger or asked for more food, they were beaten with wooden clubs and given even less food the following day. Children who couldn't successfully trap rabbits, catch fish, or kill birds with their bare hands received no food at all. Parents would watch their children slowly starve rather than provide assistance. This wasn't cruelty. It was preparation for adulthood in a society where survival depended entirely on individual capability. These weren't toys. They were functional weapons designed to inflict serious injuries. Children were expected to practice with these weapons for 6 hours every day, regardless of weather conditions or their physical state. During weapons practice, children fought against each other in combat that regularly resulted in broken bones, deep cuts, and permanent injuries. Parents encouraged their children to aim for maximum damage during these practice fights. A child who held back or showed mercy to an opponent was beaten by their parents and forced to fight again until they drew blood. Broken arms and legs were left to heal naturally, often resulting in permanent deformities. Deep cuts were packed with mud and left untreated. Viking parents believed that children who received medical care would grow into adults who couldn't function while injured in battle. The most brutal aspect of Viking weapons training involved deliberate maiming. When children turned 8 years old, their parents would intentionally inflict permanent injuries to test their tolerance for disability. Some children had fingers cut off, others had their eardrums punctured with sharp sticks. Many children had deliberate scars carved into their faces and bodies. A child who complained about pain or requested help was subjected to additional maiming. Parents kept track of how many deliberate injuries each child could tolerate before breaking down completely. Children who broke down before receiving at least 5 permanent injuries were considered too weak to survive and were often abandoned in the wilderness. Viking parents believed that children needed to experience the deepest possible fear and despair before they could develop proper emotional control. Starting at age 3, children were regularly subjected to controlled terror designed to break their spirit completely. Parents would lock their children in underground pits filled with human bones and rotting animal carcasses. Children might spend weeks in these pits with no light, no human contact, and minimal food. The smell alone was enough to cause permanent psychological damage. Children who emerged from the pits without showing signs of mental breakdown were considered ready for the next level of psychological training. Parents would tell their children in vivid detail about the horrible deaths they would suffer if they showed weakness as adults. Children learned about being slowly flayed alive, having their eyes gouged out, and being eaten by wild animals. These weren't bedtime stories. They were detailed instructional sessions designed to implant permanent fear into children's minds. Children as young as 5 years old were required to help their parents inflict slow, agonizing deaths on captured enemies. Children who showed mercy or hesitation during these executions were beaten and forced to continue until they could torture prisoners without showing them. The sexual education practices would horrify modern parents. Viking children learned about sexuality through direct participation in adult activities. Children were present during all sexual activity between adults and were expected to participate when they reached puberty, which Vikings considered to occur around age 10 for girls and age 12 for boys. Girls who reached menarche were immediately considered ready for marriage and childbearing, regardless of their physical or emotional development. Parents arranged marriages for girls as young as 9 years old. These weren't symbolic ceremonies. They were functional marriages that included immediate sexual activity and expectations of pregnancy. When boys turned 12, they were subjected to gang sexual assault by adult male community members. This wasn't considered abuse. It was considered necessary preparation for the sexual violence they would inflict and experience as adult warriors. Children who resisted sexual initiation were beaten, starved, and subjected to additional physical torture until they submitted completely. Parents who tried to protect their children from sexual initiation were exiled from the community and often killed for interfering with traditional practices. The educational system involved no reading, writing, or intellectual development. Viking children learned only practical skills related to warfare, survival, and reproduction. Any child who showed interest in abstract thinking or creative activities was punished for wasting time on useless pursuits. Children who asked questions about topics unrelated to immediate survival were beaten and given additional physical training. Curiosity was considered a dangerous weakness that distracted from the single-minded focus required for survival. Children learned to suppress all intellectual interests and focus exclusively on developing their capacity for violence and endurance. Children were expected to perform adult-level physical labor starting at age 4. This included hauling heavy stones, chopping wood for hours in freezing temperatures, and participating in the construction of fortifications and buildings. Children who couldn't complete their assigned work received no food and were subjected to additional physical punishment. There were no rest periods, no consideration for fatigue or injury, and no accommodation for differences in physical capability. Children worked until they collapsed from exhaustion, then were forced to continue working while unconscious. Children as young as 6 years old were brought on raiding expeditions and expected to participate in actual combat. These children weren't protected or kept away from danger. They were deliberately placed in life-threatening situations to test their courage and fighting ability. Children who showed fear during raids were killed by their own parents rather than being allowed to return home as cowards. Children who survived their first raid were immediately sent on more dangerous expeditions. The goal wasn't to protect children, it was to identify which children had the potential to become effective adult warriors. Viking parents believed that children who received medical treatment would become dependent on outside help and unable to survive independently. When children became sick or injured, they were left to recover on their own or die trying. Children with chronic illnesses or disabilities were abandoned in the wilderness within days of birth. Parents who kept disabled children were considered weak and were often expelled from their community. This wasn't selective infanticide, it was systematic elimination of any child who might require resources without contributing to community survival. Dental problems, skin infections, and minor injuries were left untreated until they became life-threatening. Children who survived serious medical problems without assistance were considered proven survivors. Children who died from treatable conditions were considered weak and unworthy of community resources. Children slept on the ground outside the family longhouse regardless of weather conditions. They were provided with minimal clothing and no bedding or shelter from rain, snow, or wind. Children who complained about cold or discomfort were forced to sleep even further from the warmth of the family dwelling. Some children were required to sleep in trees or in holes dug in the ground. The goal was to ensure that children never developed expectations of comfort or protection from elements. Children caught trying to build shelters or find warmer sleeping locations were beaten and forced to sleep in even more exposed positions. The message was clear: comfort was weakness, and weakness meant death. The disciplinary methods used by Viking parents would result in immediate criminal charges today. Physical beatings were administered with wooden clubs, metal tools, and stones. Children were regularly beaten until they lost consciousness, Parents who didn't beat their children hard enough were criticized by other community members for raising weak offspring. Parents kept careful track of how much physical punishment each child could tolerate, and gradually increased the severity to build tolerance for extreme pain. The goal was complete submission and acceptance of parental authority regardless of the physical cost. Children learned to accept beatings passively and never resist or attempt to protect themselves. Parents believed that emotional comfort made children unable to cope with the harsh realities of adult life. Children who cried, showed fear, or asked for reassurance were immediately punished for displaying weakness. Viking children learned never to express emotional needs or seek comfort from their parents. Children who attempted to form emotional bonds with their parents were rejected and subjected to additional harsh treatment designed to break those emotional connections completely. The result was a generation of children who learned to suppress all emotional expression and function, as isolated individuals focused exclusively on survival. Modern psychologists would recognize these children as suffering from severe emotional trauma and developmental disorders. Vikings saw them as properly prepared for adult life. Children who survived Viking parenting became warriors capable of extraordinary physical endurance, tolerance for pain, and willingness to inflict violence on others. Viking adults suffered from what modern medicine would recognize as severe post-traumatic stress disorder, emotional dysfunction, and inability to form healthy relationships. The entire Viking society was essentially a community of severely traumatized individuals who had learned to function despite extreme psychological damage. His fingers had been permanently damaged by frostbite. His body was covered with scars from deliberate injury. His emotional capacity had been systematically destroyed through years of psychological torture. He could survive for weeks without food. He could inflict terrible violence on enemies without hesitation or remorse. He could endure physical conditions that would incapacitate modern adults within minutes. Modern parents would see a deeply traumatized young man who had been systematically tortured throughout his childhood. The difference in perspective reveals just how dramatically our understanding of childhood and human development has changed over the past 1,000 years. The Viking parenting methods worked within the context of their harsh environment and violent society. Children who survived this training became adults capable of thriving in conditions that would destroy people raised with modern parenting methods. But the human cost was staggering, and the psychological damage was permanent and irreversible. As societies became more stable and less dependent on individual physical capability for survival, the brutal training methods that produced Viking warriors became unnecessary and eventually recognized as harmful. Today, any parent who subjected their child to even the mildest version of Viking child-rearing practices would face immediate arrest, prosecution, and permanent loss of custody. The methods that Vikings considered essential for proper child development are now recognized as severe abuse that causes lifelong psychological and physical damage. The transformation from Viking parenting to modern child rearing represents one of the most dramatic shifts in human cultural evolution. We've moved from a system designed to produce warriors capable of extreme violence and endurance, to a system designed to produce emotionally healthy individuals capable of cooperation and creative thinking. Children subjected to systematic brutality can develop extraordinary capabilities for survival and violence. The question isn't whether these methods work, it's whether the results are worth the cost and whether they're necessary for survival in our current environment. Olaf lived to age 43, which was considered a remarkably long life for a Viking. He participated in dozens of raids, killed countless enemies, and raised his own children using the same brutal methods his father had. He never questioned whether there might be better ways to prepare children for adult life, because questioning tradition was itself considered weakness. The children who had been systematically tortured in the name of preparation, and parents who tortured their own children for the same reason. It took centuries for human societies to recognize that survival might be possible without destroying childhood in the process. Modern parents reading about Viking child-rearing practice experience horror and disbelief. It seems impossible that any human society could systematically inflict such suffering on children. But the Vikings weren't unusually cruel. They were responding rationally to environmental conditions that demanded extreme measures for survival. In environments where weakness means death, parents will systematically eliminate weakness from their children regardless of the psychological cost. In environments where cooperation and creativity are more valuable than physical toughness, parents will focus on developing those capabilities instead. In a world where children who couldn't tolerate extreme pain would die as adults, parents who failed to inflict extreme pain on their children were essentially condemning them to death. The methods seem insane today because our survival requirements have changed completely. Understanding Viking parenting helps explain why modern gentle parenting methods would have been impossible in medieval Scandinavia. Parents who raised emotionally secure, Intellectually curious children would have watched those children die within years of reaching adulthood. The environment demanded psychological damage as a prerequisite for survival. We can afford gentle parenting because our children don't need to survive in conditions that require extreme physical and psychological toughness. Our survival challenges are different, so our parenting methods have evolved accordingly. The children who survived Viking parenting became the ancestors of modern Scandinavian, who now practice some of the most gentle and supportive parenting methods in the world. The genetic descendants of systematically brutalized children have become advocates for child protection and emotional nurturing. Cultural evolution moved faster than genetic evolution, transforming parenting completely within a few generations. This dramatic transformation proves that human parenting behavior is highly adaptable and responds quickly to changing environmental conditions. When survival requirements change, parenting methods change accordingly. The brutality wasn't genetic. It was environmental adaptation that disappeared when the environment changed. Modern parents believe they're giving their children the greatest possible gift, the ability to thrive in a world that rewards emotional intelligence and creativity. Both approaches represent rational responses to their respective environmental. The ultimate irony is that Viking parenting methods, which seemed so essential for survival at the time, would now guarantee failure in modern society. Children raised with Viking brutality would be completely unable to function in environments that require cooperation, emotional regulation, and abstract thinking. The methods that once ensured survival would now ensure destruction. This reveals the fundamental challenge of preparing children for a future that might be completely different from the present. Viking parents prepared their children for a world of constant physical threat and scarcity. Modern parents prepare their children for a world of psychological complexity and abundance. Both approaches represent educated guesses about what survival will require in the future. Every single practice that Vikings considered essential for proper child development is now illegal and recognized as harmful. The complete reversal of values represents one of the most dramatic cultural transformations in human history. Children who would have been considered perfectly prepared for life by Viking standards would now be considered severely damaged and in need of extensive psychological treatment. Children who would have been considered hopeless by Viking standards now thrive in modern environments. The definition of successful child development has been completely inverted. The methods that shaped an entire civilization for generations disappeared completely when they were no longer necessary for survival. This demonstrates both the adaptability of human culture and the power of environmental pressure to shape behavior across generations. Today, the idea of deliberately inflicting systematic physical and psychological damage on children seems unthinkable. But for Vikings, the idea of raising children without such preparation would have seemed like child abandonment. The moral framework around parenting has transformed as completely as the practical method, creating two completely incompatible approaches to human development. They represent adaptations to current environmental conditions, just as Viking methods represented adaptations to their environmental conditions. Future generations may look back on modern parenting with the same mixture of horror and understanding that we now apply to Viking practices. But for now, the transformation from systematic brutality to systematic nurturing represents genuine progress in human civilization. We've learned that survival is possible without destroying childhood, and that children can be prepared for adult challenges without being traumatized in the process. The Vikings proved that extreme measures produce extreme capabilities. Modern parents are proving that gentle methods can produce equally valuable capabilities suited to different challenges. The children who survived Viking parenting became legendary warriors whose exploits still fascinate us today. The children who benefit from modern parenting are becoming innovators, artists, and thinkers whose contributions may be equally legendary to future generations. Both approaches succeed within their respective contexts, but the human cost of success has been dramatically reduced. The gentle efficiency of modern child rearing is creating civilizations that dominate the contemporary world through superior technological and creative culture. The methods changed completely, but the goal remained the same: preparing children to thrive in their anticipated future environment.